Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey everyone, welcome to the FigureItOutcast for October 2024. I am your host, Adam Koralik, and I am joined by the indestructible Joseph Tamburino. Welcome back, dude.
Thanks for having me back, Adam.
Always. So, for those who are brand new to this show, welcome. You guys just missed our 100th episode, which, Joseph, do you think that turned out well? Did you enjoy that?
I did. Yeah.
Good.
It was definitely fun being on it, that's for sure.
Yeah. We had a bunch of cameos from former people. It was great. Well, they're still people, but, former people who were in the show. But anyway, yeah. So if you're unaware, this is a Patreon-backed podcast, which means you get early access to this, and you just support the channel if you sign up to Patreon. You can pick subjects, you can get shout-outs, you can even be on the show, such as Joseph is. And I'll just appreciate you doing that, as you also get early access to all my videos in general over there, and occasionally there's some exclusive content that makes its way on there as well. But yeah, so with that out of the way, all that stuff's in the description, so like the video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, and check out all the social media stuff in the description. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, Travel Channel, etc. Appreciate it. Now let's go ahead and get started. So, Joseph, I guess I'll just get this out of the way up front. Abdullah's not going to be here today because he was having technical issues, so we miss him, but Joseph is going to step up to the bat and cover the whole show with me. So thank you, Joseph, for doing that.
You're welcome.
And so the first subject is actually one that you selected, so I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce your basic premise here.
Alrighty, sure. So, I'm not sure how many people nowadays who listen to the podcast are aware of a certain book that came out back in 2014, I think it was, but there's this book called Console Wars by Blake Harris, basically about the whole hit story of Sega versus Nintendo in the fourth generation of game consoles. And that was the first time that we heard a very interesting tidbit about Sega's history in the console space. Namely, that after Nintendo broke their contract with Sony for the Nintendo PlayStation, the Nintendo PlayStation SNES add-on thing that was going on back then, Sega and Sony's engineering teams actually worked together for a little bit, trying to figure out a way to create a console together, and that entire prospect kind of fell apart because of reasons. We're not sure of the exact reasons, and honestly, if the only source we had of this was the Console Wars book, I probably wouldn't have put stock in it. But around the same time, there were independent interviews with Tom Kalinske who confirmed that this almost bizarre idea of two game companies teaming up, well, what we think of the game companies teaming up to make a console together, actually almost happened. So basically, Sega and Sony were trying to work together to come up with a fifth generation console, and like I said, it fell apart. We could speculate about why. Personally, I think it's mostly just because the engineering team was from Sega Japan, and Sega Japan employees other than the big boss at the top, Nakayama, basically did not like anything that was suggested from the U.S. division, and this was basically something Tom Kalinske and Sony U.S. put together, so it kind of fell apart. But I've actually been thinking about this for a while. I mentioned a couple of, I don't know how many podcast episodes ago, but I was originally at some point planning to do an alternate history of video games YouTube channel, and the idea of what we think would have happened if Sega and Sony actually was able to get that console out in the fifth generation was actually going to be my debut episode. So I figured, hey, we talk about this alternate history stuff all the time on this podcast now, usually because of someone else suggesting it. But Adam, what do you think what would have happened if Sega and Sony actually made a game console together in the fifth generation? So instead of Sony, PlayStation, and Sega Saturn, and then everyone else, it was just Sega and Sony together with that one. So there was no Saturn and no PlayStation as we know it. And how did we think that would affect things going obviously into the 5th generation, but also beyond that.
So, so I think should I start with explaining how that scenario even came into existence in fuller detail?
Yes,
okay,
so context.
Right. Okay, so context is key here. So I'm going to go back and tell the Nintendo PlayStation's story, which, by the way, if you guys didn't see it, I did a video on it, like, really recently, because I got access to it again. You know, that's a whole different story. Maybe we can talk about another time, like how I managed to pull that one off. But we got access to the, you know, the lone Nintendo PlayStation prototype. And so I don't know, Joseph, if you saw that video or this subject is just a coincidence.
I actually missed that one. I'll have to go watch that video.
So, like, literally, that was my video last week at the time of this recording. I got access to it, as well as this. Obviously, I had the Sega Pluto, the Jaguar dental unit, but I also had things like the Atari Graduate. I had the first Macintosh mouse. I also had the first mouse ever, like the one from 1967. So anyway, we had this table full of insanity, and I got to do a video on all of it. But so let's just pretend, hey, that's what inspired Joseph to want to talk about the Nintendo PlayStation.
That's fair.
Yeah,
I mean, I did see the thumbnail. It's just I haven't gotten around to watching it.
No,
honestly,
it's all good.
So.
It's all good. It's not going anywhere. All right, so basically, here's a rather truncated version of what went down. If I recall correctly, in 1988, I think it was then Ken Kutaragi buys a Famicom, and he finds that the audio technology in it was just kind of weak sauce, and he thought Sony could do so much better than this, and so he basically designed something and has Sony basically take it to Nintendo and say, like, hey, don't you think it would be cool if your next generation of systems had this? And Nintendo was, oh my god, yeah, this is awesome, to the point where I think that sound chip is actually in the Super Nintendo.
It is, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so they were all like, yeah, this is so much better, we should totally be doing this. And that partnership, you know, came with some papers signed, agreements understood, etc., etc. But at a certain point in the Super Nintendo lifespan, they started thinking, like, man, this went so well, wouldn't it be cool if we, like, did a system together? And that system started off as an attachment for the Super Nintendo. So you can think of it like a Sega CD. It was basically SNES CD. And the basic idea was that Sony was going to design that hardware, and, you know, Nintendo would make the games for it, because then Nintendo wouldn't have as much stress in dealing with hardware divisions. They'd almost become a developer for their own hardware division, as opposed to having a hardware division, if you follow my mentality there. And Sony would bring, like, higher technology quality at an affordable price, and blah, 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 blah. What ends up happening is the prototype is redesigned a few different ways, and ultimately you end up with the, shall we say, Nintendo PlayStation prototype, or PlayStation Zero, as we kind of comically dub it now, that we have seen in the one I just did a video on, where it was completely designed by Sony, but was authorized into existence by Nintendo. It could play Famicom cartridges. Obviously, if they had redesigned it slightly for North America, it would have designed for Super Nintendo cartridges, etc. And it had a disc drive with a format called Super CD. What ultimately happens is that Nintendo starts reevaluating their contract. I want to say in around 1993, so it was like 5 years after the initial Ken Kutaragi deal. And they're getting ready to go to production here, and Nintendo kind of looks at some of the language in the original contract and realizes all the software developed for the CD-ROM was going to be property of Sony, whereas everything for the cartridge slot was going to be property of Nintendo. Initially, that made sense, because they're like, oh, all the games will be through that. So, and Nintendo did not care about things like music CDs, karaoke CDs, whatever. But they were now being told and expected to make games specifically for the disk drive. However, it meant, in short, if Nintendo made, say, you know, a Super Mario Worlds 2, like a more proper one or whatever, for the Super CD disk drive, that they wouldn't see a dime off the sales for it. Sony would get 100% of the proceeds, even though Nintendo made it. which Nintendo was like, well, that's ridiculous. We're not going to do that. So they went to Sony being like, hey, can we kind of clean up the language of this? Because obviously if we're making a game for the disc drive, you guys aren't going to be making 100% of the money. That's ridiculous. They expected Sony to be like, oh yeah, that's just an oversight. Our bad. We'll clean that all up. And Sony was like, no, bruh, you signed it. That means you have to make games for it and we get all the money for it. And Nintendo was like, no. Like, why would we agree to that? This is a side step to that story. Ben Heck, who later would take the Nintendo PlayStation prototype apart and had more intimate access to it than anybody, he had a little hypothesis that he thought part of the problem with it wasn't just that, it was also that the disc drive was comically underpowered. He described it as the Super Nintendo with load times, as in it didn't really offer any additional benefits. So if that's true as well, you could see why Nintendo wouldn't really have liked the direction Sony was going with this. But anyway, back to the original point. So since Sony was uncooperative, but Nintendo couldn't stop them from proceeding with the prototype and into a full development unit, they decided, okay, if they want to be like that, then we're going to be like that too. So then what Nintendo does is they go to Philips, which was the #1 technological competitor to Sony. And nothing much came of that, except that's how you ended up with what is jokingly referred to as the Zelda Unholy Triforce, as well as Hotel Mario. Basically, Nintendo licensed out some of their characters to help the fledgling Philips CDI, which is a system that gets a bad rap because people often think of it too much as a video game console, when really that was like 6th on its goal list. It was more of an educational tool you would put in schools that played its own movie format and music CDs and whatever. Anyway, doesn't matter. For those who actually bought a CDI, there was going to be Nintendo brand licensed games on there, which is not even made by Nintendo, making them really unique. That should tell you, since how protective Nintendo is of their IP, that they were willing to do that. That should tell you how much Sony upset them. And so at that time, Sony got really upset about that and said, okay, you're going to work with our #1 competitor, we'll work with yours. So Sony goes to Sega, and they're basically like, we're going to start making games for you because we hate Nintendo. That's how you got Sewer Shark. There was some Sony video game company created around that time. I remember Sewer Shark specifically was, I think it was like Sony Imageworks or something like that. They started making games specifically for the Sega CD. And out of that relationship comes what you're talking about, where
Right.
there was a brief hiccup of maybe we can make a console together. So that's the extent to what we know is true, other than the fact that ultimately the deal did not go through. What ends up happening is Sega gets a few games made by Sony. Philips got a few games licensed by Nintendo, which, by the way, there are 2 unreleased CDI Mario games. One's called Mario Wacky Worlds. Prototypes of it have been dumped. There's also another one. I think it's like Mario Takes America or something. That one was in development. All of the Nintendo brand CDI games were actually developed in Canada, oddly enough. And that last one, while they were in production on it, I guess, I don't know how Canadian law works on this, but I guess the company producing it hadn't paid their taxes or something. So the Canadian government seized all the assets, including the prototypes of that game. And to this day, they sit in a vault in Ottawa. So hypothetically, if anybody wanted to spend the money, they could unlock and release this game. Not that anybody seems to care to. But anyway, that's all Philips got out of it. Nintendo truly got nothing out of this whole situation. They created their #1 competitor, and their next step was to say, CDs suck, let's use cartridges again because they're tried and true. And of course, nothing more vengeful than a lover scorned. So PlayStation became the PlayStation as we know it. So, with that understanding of history, I agree, Joseph. Let's talk about what that system could have been. And for our purposes, we are just going to call it the Sega PlayStation, because I do think that there's a very strong possibility that Sega would have been on board with that name. Sega was pretty good about just using kind of random words as names, unlike Nintendo, who just kind of used their name as part of the name. Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, etc. GameCube's probably the only system they ever made with like a good name. But yeah, anyway, I'll let you speculate first.
Alrighty. So, with the Sega PlayStation, There's one thing we have to get out like right away as far as like the 5th generation goes. It probably almost doesn't matter what the system's capabilities actually are when you look at everything else and like at all the other potential competitors in context. Like the fact that Sega and Sony are team up and put out a console together basically takes out the what we know of as the winner of the 5th generation and the 3rd place runner-up. So basically, unless if the console like Xbox 360 Red Rings of Death everywhere, Sega and Sony basically win the 5th generation just flat out. There's basically no possible way they could have lost, because Nintendo's not going to change anything with the N64, and the 3DO and the Amiga CD32,
Jaguar, FM
the Jaguar,
Towns, Mari.
none of them would have been had a chance at touching the PlayStation, like the Sony PlayStation. They're not going to be able to do it when you also add in Sega as well, especially considering the fact that the Saturn was actually somewhat successful in Japan.
It did well over there. It came in second, so they would have utterly dominated Japan. That's indisputable. Yeah, and I can't imagine there's a scenario where they wouldn't have won North America and Europe under that context.
Yeah, like the only possible way I could think of that they could have, like, anyone would have had a shot at beating them in North America and Europe is if Nintendo somehow randomly decides that, yeah, they're going to go with CDs and manage to get the N64 out, like, 2 years early.
So, I'm going to throw a bit of a monkey wrench in that one. I agree with you. There's no chance the 3DO or, you know, the Jaguar or the Pippin or any of that would have had any realistic chance in that scenario. No dispute. However, I will say this about Nintendo. In the real timeline we live in, they did release the N64 like almost 2 years after the PS1 and Saturn were released. Meaning, if we agree that the quote-unquote Sega PlayStation, in whatever form it was, came out in 1994 as both the PS1 and Saturn did. Keep in mind, the PS1 and the Saturn launched only like 2 weeks apart from each other in reality.
Yeah.
But the N64 at its earliest launch date was about 1.5 years later. So yeah, like summer of 96 is when the N64 comes out in Japan. So that being said, if this system had come out, Nintendo would have had enough time to basically be like, maybe we don't do the cartridge thing. Maybe we do this slightly differently. Now, imagine the N64 if they had, from the get-go, as their medium of choice had been like what they did with the 64DD, which was, you know, more expansive, more capable, cheaper to produce. It's just they just didn't do it because the add-ons were, you know, of course, a bad idea. They had more memory in them, etc. If they had done, I guess we would call it now closer to something like a floppy disk drive as opposed to a cartridge slot or a disk drive, and that technology had proven successful enough and effective enough, they could have also hypothetically made other changes under the hood with that other 1.5 years of development that might have benefited them, because the cartridges was really the biggest hindrance to that system from a technological, economic, and political. I mean, I say political meaning like their relationship with developers standpoint, because very, very few developers wanted to work with them. They were obviously harder and more expensive to produce, and they were far more limiting because of storage capacity and things like that, as well as...
You know, that's a good point. If Nintendo has the disk system as the base N64, they might not have lost Squaresoft, which...
Exactly.
Which, considering Final Fantasy VII is, at least in Japan, what actually decided the PlayStation versus Saturn.
Yep.
From what I heard about it. Like, they were, from what I heard and read about it, they were pretty neck and neck until FF7 was a Sony exclusive in our timeline.
Yeah. And the reason Japan. It was... Yeah, exactly. And the reason it was an exclusive over there is, you know, as you mentioned, Squaresoft lost interest in Nintendo over cartridges, so it was going to be one of the other two. But Sega's big problem is the Saturn was really complicated and was really kind of built for a different mentality, which was effectively the 2D stuff is the future, and 3D elements is the way we're going to go. And Sony saw it a different way, saying, yeah, it can be crude 3D, but people will still like it. In other words, theirs was easier to program for and was more affordable, which Square just kind of saw that as the way to go. So in a timeline where you get a hypothetically easy to develop for, easier, better visualized capabilities of a Sega console called the Sega PlayStation, for our argument's sake, that would be a hell of a machine. And it would be then up to Square to decide, was the Nintendo Disk System, the 64DD, enough for their game to maintain that relationship? Or do they say that's still too limiting and they're going to go with this other thing? So Nintendo would have home court advantage, per se, in that Squaresoft was always with them. And they didn't go with the cartridges, which was their number one weakness there. So the question just comes to, would the 64DD stuff have been enough?
Yeah, or would Nintendo have actually done it after what happened with Sony?
Yeah,
is the question.
No, of course, that's another hypothetical altogether. I'm just saying, in a scenario where these two coalesce into one platform, it is possible Nintendo might have had a little bit of a rude awakening, but because of the actual real timeline where they had an extra year and a half to get the N64 out, they might have said, okay, maybe don't do cartridges. Maybe they have a case here. Maybe we need to do something different.
It might have just been that they would have saw that, okay, right now there is only one console out until we get ours out, and they have the CD stuff, and those games are like, holy crap. Maybe if that happened, then maybe, and Nintendo went with that. It's going to depend on people like Squaresoft or like Konami with Metal Gear Solid and stuff like that.
The other thing we have to factor in is Nintendo tries. They actually genuinely try to keep the prices of their consoles down. Part of the reason you realize the N64 launched at $200, which is only about $400 in 2024. Whereas the Saturn launched at $400, hence that famous quote from Sony about $299. Basically, they were trying to advance the tech, which made it more expensive. Nintendo comes out a year and a half later and is already undercutting even the PlayStation by $100 at launch. The disc system would not have been able to tell that story. It would have been at least a $300 machine, so they would have lost that advantage.
Not necessarily, because the only reason Sony did $299 was to undercut Sega.
Yes, but that's
the way that happened. There's no way that was actually planned until that E3.
Yeah, and I understand that, but Sony was willing to lose money on hardware. Nintendo is not. They've always been like that. They still are like that.
Oh yeah, no, that's true. But I'm just saying that in this hypothetical scenario, the Sega PlayStation, at least at launch, is a $400 machine.
You maintain it's a $400 machine, okay? And I'm saying that Nintendo. I'm disputing what they might have done in response, and I guess we should go back.
That's true. I guess if Nintendo is still like coming out like at a $200 or $250 machine or a $300 machine, that does actually support your point that they're undercutting them. Yeah.
So I don't know. We don't know that because we don't even know the first part. It's all hypothetical. But a Sega PlayStation in that context, I agree with you, would have dominated. But we have to talk about what that hardware would have been, and then we can speculate probably why that was an issue at all. If history is any indicator, here's what we know about both of those companies at that time. Sony was gung-ho on basically owning the software rights to basically everything. They didn't really care about the hardware side of things. They knew that's not where the money was. Hence the famous quote from them was, give away the razor to sell the blades. That's why they sold the PS1 so much cheaper than it actually cost to produce. Because they were like, if it's successful, you're selling tons and tons of games. That's where the money is. That's why they were so willing to screw Nintendo over on it, because they were like, we'll just get tons and tons of money out of this. Sega's mentality was push the technology, push the hardware, and try to bring the arcade experience home, which was still kind of a very Japanese 1980s mindset that didn't really translate anywhere other than Japan. And because of that, we know with Sega that they made ridiculously different complex hardware, the Saturn, all and competing hardware no less, the 32X, the Saturn, etc. Would Sony have been able to get Sega to just sit down and be like, look, pick a street? This would be kind of hard coming from Sony, who themselves had multiple iterations of a CD attachment for the Super Nintendo. It wasn't just one. Like, they made
Right.
up to 6 of these damn things. So it's they didn't really know what to do any more than Sega did. And part of me thinks they would have fallen back and kind of let Sega take the lead, since Sega was already the established hardware manufacturer. However, then you have to wonder why Sega would even care what Sony thinks about it, because Sony was not a developer, really. They're not making the hardware in this scenario. What are they contributing other than eating our lunch every time we sell a game? And that's probably what killed it, I would imagine.
Probably, yeah.
But getting the two of them to coalesce on a plan where Sega says, okay, you're right, we don't really have a great streamlined process for our hardware. We'll let Sony make the hardware. We'll just develop games with it. We'll let them handle developing games. I don't know what the terms of that would have been. Like, I find it really hard to believe the two of them could have kept that going together. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
Like, how does that work? Does Sega become a third-party developer for their own system?
I mean, yeah, I mean, possibly. Like, it depends. Like, and that's where we would get going, because, I mean, right now they have the agreement for one system, and I'm pretty sure that, like, Sega wouldn't have, knowing what happened with Nintendo and why that deal fell apart, wouldn't have let Sony actually get away with 100% of all software sales for the system. Like, at the very least, their games probably would have, money would have at least gone to Sega for that. But, yeah, that's actually, figuring that out is actually, like, a good question, and where this would lead, like, regardless of what happens, because, like, they have it for the 5th gen system, but do they continue the partnership into the 6th gen? Does Sony, since they have a lot more money at this point, and decide that they want more control over the PlayStation brand, and, like, see if they can buy Sega or something?
Who knows? But I mean, that's a factor, because they are both Japanese, so technically that would have been possible. Yeah. But the other thing that to debate there is, it's interesting, because Sega would have been in the position at the time of, like, the only thing we would want out of Sony is for them to deal with the hardware side of things. While Sega was still doing hardware, they were obviously, and they were good at it, they weren't good at streamlining it and making it kind of everybody on the same page. Sony would have wanted out of Sega, like, lots of content for the system, software sales, etc. But then Sega has no financial incentive to really do that, because they're expected to just hand over so much of what they're producing over to Sony. Meanwhile, from Sega's perspective, they're the ones who were already proven to be successful in hardware, and we're going to just hand over our empire to this other company that has never tried this. You know what I mean? Like, it's...
Yeah.
I can see why it's a marriage that at first looks like a great idea from us as fans from, 25, 30 years removed. But at the time, I don't see why either one of them would want to do this, other than just the marketing potential.
Yeah, no, I mean, the fact that it's such a long shot of actually happening is what makes talking about the scenario fun. But
I agree completely. So let's just make the argument case that, they for some reason, they come to a deal. Sony's going to make the hardware. Sega's going to make the software. And what they'll do is they'll come up with some sort of agreement on how software sales works. So maybe, and I'm just floating this because this is ridiculous, I guess, but hardware sales, it'll be like a 70-30 split in favor of Sony. Software sales produced by Sony are 100% theirs. Software sales produced by Sega, 100% theirs. And then third-party deals are like a 50-50 split or something like that. Because then everybody's getting everybody's own lunch, and there's no, like, crazy jealousy over, like, well, the thing is, Sony's entire model was The hardware doesn't matter. Focus on the games and just pump those out. So it would be hard for me to accept that they would be willing to just let Sega have like 100% of the disc proceeds. So you have to cut them in at like in a reasonable deal.
Oh yeah.
So anything Sony themselves makes, cool. Anything Sega themselves makes, cool. That's theirs. It's the third party stuff where I think it would be best to do. Aside from the proceeds, obviously the actual developers and like, Activision makes a game for them. Activision gets their cut, and whatever is meant as the rest, the part that you either give to Sega or Sony, that part just gets cut in half. I think that would have been the way to do it. And from the hardware perspective, you cut Sega in at some sort of nominal percentage that's not unreasonable considering they don't have to make it. So Sony gets the majority there since they're the ones actually producing the hardware. And then you'd have to have very clear terms on like, what do we want to try to achieve here? What's our, do we want to focus on maybe internet capabilities, whatever all that stuff is. That's the kind of stuff they would have had to have figured out. And I'm betting both of them just saw enough reason to say the other side doesn't make sense in our plans. That would be my guess.
Probably.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Does that sufficiently satiate your thirst for this subject?
Yeah, no, I definitely liked the curveball you threw at me with Nintendo actually realizing that, crap, we need to use discs. Because when I was first thinking about it, my thought process was they were still going to go with cartridges because they were burned, which led to things different.
I mean, they might have. Nintendo is pretty, stalwart in their inability to change. But with an extra year and a half of development and like time to realize, like, wow, we just created our biggest competition. Just got like a supercharged. We
just gave our biggest competition the support of one of the biggest consumer electronics companies.
Yeah, exactly. So they might have gotten... Yeah, exactly. They might have got a little desperate and said, okay, what can we do? Beyond just like, okay, we're not going to let Philips do anything with us again. Maybe Philips would have cut us some cheap chips or something. But, beyond that, I don't think they would have done... That's where I wonder if they would have either switched to discs outright in conjunction with Philips, or if they would have gone with their own disk drive system as opposed to cartridges at all. Now, the disk drive system would have still been very limiting, but it wouldn't have been as bad. It would have had, I think each disk had like 110 megabytes of storage, as opposed to the average like 32 megabytes on an N64 cartridge.
Yeah.
I don't know what other capabilities it had, to be honest with you. That's the thing with the 64 DD, is it wasn't really that impressive. It might have been impressive had it been the main system, but that's, by the time it came out, it was irrelevant. So that doesn't really matter. But yeah, I don't know. Interesting to think about these alternate timelines. And that's one of the few where, when we talk about these alternate timelines, like, what if this happened? That's one of the few where you can see it actually having worked out had basically cooler heads prevailed,
Yeah. The fact that it was also something that, like, it's not just a case of, hey, what if the GameCube won Gen 6? Or what if, like, the SNK, like Neo Geo CD, was somehow super successful. This was a thing that could have potentially happened if a deal in our timeline didn't fall apart.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
But then again, we also there was the timeline like where the Nintendo PlayStation worked out. Maybe we'll save that for next time.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, let's move on. So, Joseph, thank you very much for picking that subject. The next one up is from Spencer Puryear, our homie. He said, it's actually funny we're talking about this because his question was, hypothetically, what company would be the best fit to enter the console space now in 2024? Now, I want to preface this by saying what he's essentially asking is like, hey, could, Apple come in and make a console, or Samsung or whatever? I don't think anybody would at this point. I do think there are several people that could, but they're not going to. I want to get that out of the way. So with that understanding, we'll wax inane here and say, who is the best fit despite the fact that we know this would never happen? And Apple. As much as I hate, I was about to say, as much as I hate to admit it, it actually would be Apple. Because they have a, it's for them, it would be kind of a relatively easy marketing gimmick. They obviously do their own hardware division. They obviously do have something of their own gaming division. They like to fit in their own.
They have their own gaming subscription thing.
Yeah, they have their own identity and own brand. And it would have been really easy to call it something like the iPlay. You know what I mean? Like it's.
Yeah, they have Apple Arcade right now, but.
Yeah,
but
I mean, I know
system.
Right. Well, they did have the Pippin, to be fair, but that's a very different
if they had a system in the modern day when they're the company they are now and not on the verge of bankruptcy.
Correct. Yes. So in short, I would say that Apple is the best fit, and will they do it? 100% zero. No. No. 100%, 0% chance.
They went into gaming because they saw that games on the iPhone and iPad were doing well, and they're like, well, we might as well do something to get somewhat better games on here, but they're not going further than what they've done. Between what's available for Mac gaming now and what they have with Apple Arcade and the iPhone and iPad, they're not going to do anything more. They have no reason to. And trying to do anything more is just going to burn a bunch of money. And that's going to be the problem with anyone else you would think of. Google tried doing the Google Stadia. They tried Stadia with the cloud gaming thing, and that burned up in their face. They're not going to try to do an actual console now. And even if they tried, they'd abandoned it way too quickly. At this point, no one would have any confidence in any console Google would put out. Yeah. Amazon had some gaming stuff they were doing, they were trying to make their own engine, but unless if things have changed recently that I don't know about, their gaming division stuff hasn't been going that well. So they're out. And
I mean, there's
who else is left that has the money?
Samsung could hypothetically do it, but I don't think that anybody's clamoring for that, and I don't think they're particularly interested either.
I mean, how into console gaming are South Korean gamers?
Yeah, that's my point. I'm literally just looking at which technological conglomerates could even do it before you break down all the reasons they wouldn't.
Right.
Samsung could hypothetically do it if they for some reason had the mental shift to do so. But yes, the mental shift is never coming, because he's 100% right. They care first and foremost about the South Korean market, where consoles are effectively irrelevant. The Apple, we said, is the best bet, although they're never going to do it. Amazon, Amazon and Google are also primed. They could do it, but they obviously have failed and don't really show much interest in it. I genuinely can't think of another company that would even maybe be interested or try at this point.
Any other TV maker,
Panasonic,
Panasonic or LG making a game console, who would want to even think of wanting to buy a console from them?
Yeah, I just I don't see
unless if the idea of what happened with the 3DO actually comes into the existence with this console and people like it, and LG or Panasonic just make one because the game console just suddenly becomes the new VCR, which no, that's not
era is over.
Gonna be a thing.
Yeah, as much as I hate to admit it, he's right. I mean, the closest thing we've had since then that actually kind of did work was the Steam Deck. But that is unfair because Valve is obviously already highly associated with video games as it is. So that doesn't really count. The idea of when we saw Microsoft just kind of jump in like that, I mean, in fact, that was their slogan for a little bit. I don't think you're going to see anybody else do that again, because the other sad reality is consoles as a concept are, as much as I love them, are kind of on their way out. PlayStation 5 Pro kind of proved we're already getting ready for the physical media removal. And when that happens, at that point, if you ask me as a diehard console fan who has been collecting them my whole life, at that point, there is no reason to have that over a PC. There just isn't.
No, there's not. At that point, Sony might as well just put the PlayStation Network on PC as a storefront and call it a day. And
precisely
not bother dealing with actual like hardware research and development costs anymore.
You know what's funny about that is that if you remember Microsoft's original reason for getting into consoles at all, they had no interest in consoles.
They wanted to keep the PC from dying.
Precisely. They wanted to make sure the PC wasn't seen as a big, bulky gimmick being replaced by consoles, which when I know when Gen Zers especially hear that, they laugh, but no, it's true. This is really
like,
what they thought.
People were like, like PS2 and PS3 days, like, you could, in theory, like, they were, like, doing internet stuff with it. You could, in theory, have made it so that, like, you could have used the PS2 as not as, like, a very good computer, but it could have been used as a computer. And the PS3 initially had Linux until someone, like, hacked it via that, and they got rid of it. But you could have, like, early PS3s, you could have installed Linux on them. You could have made it a computer.
Precisely. So, because their mentality for getting into that industry was, we want to have a say in where this industry goes, and that was the number one thing, was just mostly using it to shield the PC market and make sure that wasn't impacted too much. As long as Microsoft was there and a relevant player, they could push consoles into a very specific direction so that it wasn't a threat to them. And ironically, they succeeded. Despite all of the problems, all the money it has cost them and has hemorrhaged. If you ever want to know why Microsoft is so willing to hemorrhage money on the Xbox brand and still be there, it is for this reason. It is because it is shoving the entire industry into a direction where it phases itself out. Sega is already gone. Sony is on the verge of making a console that has no reason to exist, because the PC will be superior to it. And its last remaining advantage, which is people who just want a standalone box they can plug in and put their disc in, is now effectively going away. Microsoft themselves, once they know Sony is okay to do that, obviously they're not going to be the big champions of physical media anymore. The last holdout would be Nintendo. You know, the ones who are making a $300 little portable that can't even come close to competing, that has its own little proprietary games that everybody enjoys anyway, Zeldas and Marios and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. The Switch, and Nintendo specifically, somewhat fittingly, will be the last oasis of the console gamer. That's where it's going to go.
Yeah.
And then Microsoft will have successfully kicked Sony out of this industry as far as what the industry is even meant to be. Which was a direct threat to PCs. So congratulations, Microsoft, I guess. But there is no other company that has a vested interest in now showing up, and pushing consoles back into some major existence. There is no big conglomerate that cares about that. Because we don't have someone like that, this is just the direction we've gone. And unfortunately, it's not going back.
Nope.
All right, well, on that depressing note, thank you, Spencer, for that subject. We're going to move on to a round of shout-outs. So all the following people are Patreon backers, and they are at the level in which they get a shout-out. So that would be Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, Tim Inman, Trey Wagner, and a new one, Jeb Malcolm. Thank you very much for joining, Jeb Malcolm, especially very recently. So once again, Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, Tim Inman, Trey Wagner, and Jeb Malcolm. Thank you so much. Appreciate you. And if anybody out there is listening to this and they want to keep the lights on over here, early access, and get shout outs, pick subjects, even be on it, once again, join the Patreon. Links in the description. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Now, we're going to move on, Joseph, to our next subject here. This would have been Abdullah's, which, funny enough, he didn't actually pick. He didn't have one, so I picked one for him. He liked it, and then he was unable to be here. So, whatever. The subject is, when is collecting more of a burden than fun? And the reason I kind of thought about this is, so yesterday I was kind of hanging out with one of the dudes in my Discord. We did a whole thing. We drove down to Springfield, Illinois to go check out the grave of Abraham Lincoln. Don't ask why. But we were down there, and we were spending a lot of time chatting because it's like a 3-hour drive from Chicago. And he collects a lot of obscure stuff. Obviously, I do too. And in talking to him, you know, we both are like excited about what we're doing. But we have so many of our friends and mutual buddies and everything that everybody's just kind of like, well, I guess I need to get that then. Like lately, I've been getting a little bit more attention to all the Brazilian consoles, like all the weird Sega variants. Then you go like, ugh, I guess that means I have to get that. And the fact that you made that noise, where you went, ugh, Does that mean it's more of a burden than it is actually any fun to you? Like, where does that psychological shift happen?
If you're getting to the point where you're going, I have to go buy that now, you're not having fun. You stop trying to collect new stuff. If you don't want it and you're only getting it because, Sega made a weird Brazilian console, don't buy it. Don't waste your money. Don't waste your time trying to track it down.
Okay. See, yeah, that was just an example in that scenario, because we were just talking about these random one-offs. Now, I'm not that bad. Like, I'm not sitting here being like, well, I need every version of the Mega Drive 3, of which there was like hundreds down there, because they just renamed that. They just used that name on tons of stuff. I don't care. Like, I have very definitive rules about what I am willing and not willing to get, etc. And every once in a while, when I find about a new one, I get excited still. So, like, have you ever heard of the Gradiente Phantom?
No.
Okay, so this is kind of a cool story, and at one point you guys will see a video on it. So you probably have heard how Sega is still doing the Master System down there.
I mean, yeah, I watch your videos. So.
I appreciate that. Right, okay, good. I'm just bringing it up as broach the subject, as it were. But people don't often ask that much, like, what was Nintendo's timeline down there? Nintendo's timeline was very strange, and one of the attempts was they tried to get the NES into Brazil. And the super short version of this story is Nintendo understood that they didn't understand Brazil. So they basically partnered with a local company, one called Gradiente. Now, they have, because of Brazilian laws, especially at the time, it was harder for companies to get into Brazil unless you partnered with a Brazilian company. Kind of like that's why we have the Samsung Saturn, because the Japanese couldn't really do business in Korea without partnering with a Korean company. It's kind of a similar idea. So they find this company called Gradiente and say, like, we want to release the NES down there, but we're going to just let you do that because we don't really know how to do this. What they kind of apparently underestimated was the Brazilian mindset of just like, okay, well, let's just do what it takes to make this work. Kind of irregardless of what is considered Western law. So they basically make an officially licensed NES that, for its shape, its shell, envision the NES, you know, the front loader, toaster, etc. Yeah, throw that away. What they ended up doing was using Atari 7800 surplus systems.
Oh, this thing.
Yes, and so they redesigned it slightly. So it took NES cartridges, and then for its controllers, they basically use Sega Genesis controllers. So you have what looks like an Atari 7800 that plays games with Sega Genesis controllers that's actually a basically officially licensed NES. And Nintendo was mortified by this, because they were like, these are our direct competitors. You just basically stole their shit to make our system. And Gradiente was like, well, we're, you know, whatever. Brazil. Like, hey, whatever. So I want it because I find its story exciting and all that sort of thing. But then there's a whole bunch of them that are just junk that I don't care about. But yeah, you get the point. I'm still excited about stuff like that. But then at the same time, I get, you know, every once in a while, I'll see some of my YouTuber buddies who make a video where they're just like, I'm out selling my collection, getting rid of all my stuff, you know, and you just can tell that they've reached that point where they're like, I'm surrounded by plastic. I don't play it. I have to sit there and dust it all the time. And it's just like a burden where I'm sitting there looking at money I could be spending on other things, and this is what I've got on my shelf, accruing nothing. I haven't reached that point, but I would argue, to answer the original question here, if you are sitting there and you have a bunch of stuff and you don't enjoy its existence, it doesn't bring anything to you other than some cumbersome sigh because you have to do something with it, or you feel the burden of like, well, I own it, so I better go spend time playing it. Not that you want to, you feel you need to. That may be a sign that maybe it's not fun for you anymore. And if that is the case, it's all right to be like that, by the way, because we get older. Our tastes change, our opinions change, our lifestyle circumstances change. You know, I'm a millennial. I'm 37. Normally, people in my age range right now would be like, well, I got a lot of bills to pay, I got kids, you know, the wife and all that stuff. I don't really need this wall of plastic. And that's why most millennials are kind of getting out right now. While it's funny enough, the Gen Xers are the ones rebuying back in. That's just how demographics work, but that's a different story entirely. I guess what I'm saying to you is, if you are feeling that way, that is okay. There is no shame in not being interested in your toys anymore. It's okay.
Right. No, like the same principle, like with like talk about like recently in like recent games where like people are like, oh no, this game lost 90% of its player base, so the game's doomed. Starfield. But
Yeah.
it's like, guys, it's a single player game. You are allowed to stop playing single player games when you're done with the single player game. It's fine. It's not the end of the world that your favorite game doesn't have like 30,000 players playing it constantly anymore, or like 100 or like 100,000 or whatever ridiculous number it had at launch. Like, it's kind of the same deal there. Like, people are. Actually, I don't know where I was going with that, but yeah.
Basically,
anyway.
I think what you were saying is the people who play these games online eventually have to accept that not everybody wants to play them anymore, and it's okay to move on.
Yeah, but like they have that attitude sometimes, like about single player stuff. It's like, it's a single player game. It's fine. But on the topic of like collections and stuff like that, like being a burden, like honestly, I'm semi at that point myself. Like, I'm not going to stop collecting, but I'm looking at my 2 full, like, shelves of games, like, right now. Like, those big, like, media shelf ones, like, that you can buy on Amazon that, like, hold, like,
Atlantic.
2000, like, PS1 games and stuff like that.
Yeah,
I'm like, next time I have to move all that stuff again. Is there anything in there that I don't actually want to keep?
Yeah, to lighten the load.
Yeah.
No, I get that completely. I completely understand that. Like, I'm probably going to have to do a move myself in, like, next year at some point. And my collection's, as you can imagine, totally insane. And so I have to decide, like, this is not a joke. I'm at the point where I'm like, is it easier to just not move? You know what I mean? And that's,
yes, it's easier to just not move. It's always easier to just not move.
But you know what I'm trying to say. It's just like, okay, well, yeah. But anyway, if you're not enjoying your collection and you see it more as an obstacle in the way of your life, then you clearly aren't enjoying it anymore. And then it becomes more of a burden than it is fun. Remember that video games, and we're talking about video games specifically, although this applies to any collection, the item you are getting, it's meant to give you some sort of entertainment value. But if the only reason you got it was for the temporary dopamine fix of getting it in the first place, and then you have no sentimental attachment to it, you're probably not built for this type of thing. And if you are the kind of person who still enjoys it, like I walk into, so I'm in my office right now, right? In my videos, there's a door behind me at that table. That door just leads to my office. I'm in that room as we record this. This room is filled with game towers that are just full of various elements of my collection. And no, I don't sit here and play it every day, but every time I come in here, I look at it and I still get a lot of joy out of the fact I'm like, oh, that's awesome that I have that. That's so cool. And it kind of is the perfect work environment for me because it keeps me excited about wanting to talk about these random things like Brazilian game consoles and all this other stuff we've been discussing today, including, you know, history of this system and how that might have worked out. To me, it's like the same. This is going to be, I'm sorry for those who don't watch any of the sports balls, but it's going to be kind of like that feeling when you go to your home team's like game. Like, I'm a big Chicago Bulls fan, right? So you watch it on TV, that's fun. You go to the actual like arena and you're surrounded by people that are just like hyped up for the exact same thing you are, and it makes you more hyped up. It kind of is like that to me. You know, even though this is obviously a bunch of plastic and nothing is sentient in here, the fact that they're in there makes me go, all right, this is the right context for this type of enjoyment. And that still works for me. Therefore, it's more fun than it is a burden. But I'm not going to lie. I sit there and I go, you know, I have to clean it now. Like, that stuff is annoying. Sure. But nothing in this world is perfect.
Yeah. Not for sure.
Any other thoughts on this?
No, I think we basically covered it. Like, yeah, if you're just not enjoying collecting anymore, where, like, you hear that, oh, there's this weird, like, variant of system that I have a big, massive collection for, I guess I have to go get that. I don't really want to. Just, you don't stop trying to get a full collection then. And just, like, just get whatever you actually want to get and not worry about it.
Precisely. Like, you're entitled to be annoyed from time to time. Like, for me, my go-to annoyed story is the Nokia N-Gage. So, like,
Right.
I was one of the 8 people on this planet that actually had an N-Gage when it was a relevant phone. And so when the system went under, GameStop was clearing all the games out. They used to be retailing for like $40-50 or whatever it was, down to $2 each. And I was like, dude, I actually have the system for, like, I walk in with $40, I can walk away with, like, half the library. So I just started getting all the games, because why not? And I got to a point where I thought I had a complete set, because I tried to cross-reference every single game I could find online and be like, which ones actually exist, which ones don't. And there was a few games where there were like records of them, but none that were actually known to exist. So I figured they were like unreleased titles, like a Virtua Cop 3, I think, that Sega they put out artwork and everything. You could even pre-order it, and they were pre-order cases. Like John Hancock actually has one of those, but an actual copy of the game does not exist. So there was one game on that list that I was like, I couldn't find any record of its existence other than that same context, which was a Warhammer 40K game. And I was like, oh, then it must not exist. So I just skipped over it and kept going on. I eventually got all the exclusives from other countries. Not that there were many. Like, there was a version of Sega Rally that only came out in Australia. I managed to get for like $3 back in the day because nobody cared. And I thought I was done. I thought the whole collection was done. I was happy with it. Great. Years later, I'm watching YouTube. I was watching actually Pete Dorr, another retro gaming YouTuber I'm sure a lot of you guys know. And he's got this video up. He's like going through his collection, and he gets to a part that he's talking about his N-Gage collection, which was just like a handful of titles. It was the ones he actually liked. And he just randomly pulls out Warhammer 40K as like a game he's got. And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. This exists? I've been looking for the game ever since, and it genuinely annoys me how hard it is to find and how expensive it is if you actually do. But that is not a burden. It's annoying, but it would still be fun for me to have.
That's a
yeah. Like, I just want to make that clear to the audience.
You don't mind that you still need to get it for your set. You mind that you can't find it for a price that's reasonable.
Precisely. That's different than like, wait a minute, I want to own every Sega console, but that means I have to get every iteration of the Bina.
Yeah, that's a completely different thing.
Yes, exactly. That's like, I got a Bina. I bought it in the Japanese junk bin for like $2. We're good. I'm done. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. I had fun. I've got it. That's great. Let's move on. But yeah, so hopefully you guys understand that, and hopefully you guys, if you're out there and you're kind of going through, a lot of you, I imagine, are millennials, and you're kind of in that mindset, it is okay to step out. But I will warn you that very likely once your kids are out of the nest, per se, they're they've done with college and they've moved out and done their own thing, but you're still in the workforce, around then you're probably going to want to rebuy a lot of your favorites. So maybe don't sell those. That's my advice to you. Now,
yeah, unless of course you're in a situation where you actually need the money.
Yeah, that's different. If you need the money, yes, if you need the money, no one's gonna judge you for that. What I'm saying is, if you're looking at your shelf and being like, I'm never gonna care about any of this stuff anymore, I might as well get some more money. That way I can kind of just, pay for an extra semester of college or whatever. Like, sure, I'm not saying don't do that, but if that's your kind of cavalier, casual attitude, I will bet you later on you're gonna be like, kind of wish I could get a GameCube again, and maybe just a couple of those games I really like. If you have favorites, I would say hold on to those, but it's perfectly acceptable to purge the rest if you're just like, why do I own 3 copies of Madden 08? I know it was the last GameCube game, and I always thought it might be valuable for that reason, but it's like, oh, look, $20. I don't need this. You're probably never going to play that again. That's fine. Mm-hmm. But that's just a suggestion. Anything else on this?
No, we're good.
All right, we're going to move on to our last subject here then, so thank you, Abdullah. This one is by Sinjeet, who I gave a little shout-out to earlier, because usually he's the one who wants us to talk about, like, weird alternate timeline stuff. So, Sinjeet, if you're listening, I hope you enjoyed that first one the most, because I never heard back from you, so I never got a subject from you, so I'm just picking one on your behalf. And this one's just going to be, if I'm honest, just kind of probably a very relatively simple one. You probably heard about this. The Nintendo Museum in Osaka is finally open. Thoughts?
Yeah, I've heard about it. I didn't really look much into what they have there, but... Yeah.
Like, would you want to see it?
I mean, yes. If I ever get to go to Japan and it's still open, yes.
So
I absolutely would want to go there.
Okay, so I'm glad we're starting there because, like, so yeah, at the time we're recording this, it just opened. For those who are interested in it, no, I have not been to it yet. I am very willing to go, but I'd be lying if I said I was like, I must do this. I don't tend to like video game museums too much, and my reasoning for it is partially because of what we just said, which is I own a lot of the stuff that most people get excited about. Meaning, like, I do a lot of cons, right? And, like, I did Long Island Retro, which is a great convention. It's one of the only two I go to that has, like, a nice museum component where we had the Pluto there, but we also have things you don't usually see, like the Joy Sound Festa, or, like, you know, the Famicom Titler, which was, like, a weird version of the Famicom, only released in, like, one country. You know, stuff like that. Some, like, you know, some Russian consoles. You know, weird stuff. Right? And to you, it's exciting because it's still stuff you haven't seen before. But when you go in there with the masses, they're like, whoa, an N64. You never see those. And you're just sitting there like, dude, bruh. You know, it's like, that's not exciting to me. The problem with museums like this, and the same, you know, is that basically they're trying to appeal to the masses. So the things you're mostly going to see are things like that. They're going to be like, all right, here's a whole section. Here's what the NES was like. It was also known as the Famicom. You know, like, that's what you're going to get is the kind of the, whoa. Like, for those people who want a very basic history lesson. Now, I don't deny the Nintendo Museum will probably have a few oddities that I myself will be like, all right, admittedly, that's cool, etc. And so I can't judge it too harshly until I actually go there. But at the time of this recording, getting into it is a pain. I've got some buddies in Japan who are like, yeah, we'll look into it. We'll try to make this work. Currently, you have to register as a lottery system. You have to plan it like months in advance. And, you know, there's no guarantee you'll get it. And apparently, you even have to have like a valid Nintendo ID so that they can prove that you're like you. Which they're like this thing that you tie to your Switch. You apparently actually need one of those. So I'm told.
Yeah, at least currently. I'm looking at it now. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't just show up and be like, oh, 2 tickets to the Nintendo Museum. You can't do that. At least not yet. I'm sure that'll change as it calms down. I'm supposed to go back to Japan. I don't know if it's at the end of December or whatever, but like supposed to go back there relatively soon. There's a possibility I might go there, but if I don't go there, I'll live.
Unless if you've already applied for the ticket drawing, you're kind of screwed, I think.
No, I know. I've talked to people about this. Like, we would be aiming for like January. Okay. So it's not impossible, but like, I guess what I'm saying is I don't care. In fact, the most interesting thing I have seen about it is actually from the gift shop. The gift shop is full of merch from everything, and it is like the first time in years Nintendo has been willing to acknowledge the Virtual Boy. They have tons of Virtual Boy merch, which I admit is cool. But from the photos I've seen, I'm like, I wouldn't want any of that. like right. None of that. It's like when I went to, have you ever been to Nintendo New York?
I have not, no.
Okay. It is a terrible store that appeals only to people who really aren't like us, where they're just like, hey, I remember playing the Nintendo. Let's check it out. Whoa, look, they have a Super Nintendo. That's rare. Like, you know, that audience. And because like everything that's sold in that store is stuff you can buy at Target. Like, nothing in there was interesting other than on the second floor they had like a little video game mini museum that had some various systems, and the only interesting one they had was the Baghdad Game Boy. You know that one?
I think I remember that. Yeah,
it was just a Game Boy that was like basically in an explosion in Operation Desert Storm in like 1991, and it survived and kept working, but the whole shell was like super damaged. So they had it on display and just showed it constantly in a state of working. They have removed that item. I'm guessing they moved it to the Nintendo Museum in Osaka, but I don't really know that for sure. But that's just pure speculation. But yeah, I guess my point is I only really care about seeing the truly weird stuff, and I would assume that this museum probably doesn't have a whole lot of weird because it's meant to do mass appeal. But that's
I'm looking at some of the stuff on the exhibits now, and now that I'm looking at it, it's like, okay, it would still be neat to go there, but it would be more less interested now that I'm looking at it. I was actually kind of hoping that Nintendo in the museum might have had some of the stuff from even like pre-video games Nintendo stuff there. Like,
yeah, like the cards and
since
all that.
they've been around for like ever.
Yeah, they've been around for like 130 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I was hoping to see some of that. I mean, maybe some of that's there. I genuinely don't know, but my guess is they probably have like a very tiny section on that, and
Right.
it mostly is just Famicom onwards. I would be shocked if there was a bunch of prototypes because Nintendo is very protective of that type of thing. So stuff like that kind of makes me get all excitable is probably not going to be much of that. It's probably going to be largely just generic stuff.
Yeah, like
the other part,
like I saw like an interactive like Game and Watch exhibit thing where like there's like a Game and Watch game on like on the wall that you play it with like your own shadow or something, but
sure,
like that's not really, which could be interesting as like a novelty, but like not anything like what we, not like there's like no, as far as I can tell, there's probably like no prototype anything there.
Yeah, that
like
would unfortunately be my guess. That would be my guess too. I agree with you. And so I'm not gonna judge it. I haven't been there. This is more like a predictions of what I think that place actually is like type of commentary. If I ever get to go there, I will obviously report back. I'm also guessing, based on the way the Japanese typically are about this type of thing, that you probably can't film much in there. At least not yet. The Japanese tend to kind of not like that. I could be dead wrong, but so far the only imagery I've really seen of it has been the gift shop. And that kind of probably says something. But, you know, we'll find out if I ever end up going there. So,
right.
Let me ask you this. Magically, you know, your job says, hey, Joseph, you're going to get a 2 weeks paid all expenses vacation to Japan, but for only 2 weeks. Are you going to put this on your list, or are you going to focus on other things?
I'd have to check to see what else there is to do in Osaka first before I decide, honestly.
Oh, I didn't say Osaka. I said Japan. Like, you have to choose to go to Osaka.
Oh, you know, I definitely would go to Japan, like, no questions asked. But
right, but
when I'm there,
right.
I thought you were talking about would I decide to go to the Nintendo Museum?
I am asking you that. Magically, you get 2 weeks in Japan. Okay, that's all that matters for the premise of the question. Do you find a day at this museum, based on what you know, worth it?
On its own, almost, but probably not.
That should tell you guys a lot.
Yeah.
I mean,
like,
I've been there.
Depending on what else is there to do in Osaka, I might work it in. But it's like, I'd have to see what else there would be to do that would be interesting in Osaka for me.
Well, Universal Studios is there, so like the Nintendo Land World is actually there.
Okay, so then yes, I would probably be going if I could get in then.
You could get into the Universal Studios part of it. That's different.
No, I bet in the Nintendo Museum. If
Okay.
I'm gonna be spending time in Osaka, then yeah, I would try to do it.
Okay, because I've been to Japan 21 times, so like it seems like I'm running out of stuff to do, and even I'm kind of like, well, I mean, if I had nothing better to do that day, like I guess what I'm saying is I'm not particularly excited to go to this. I'm curious,
Yeah,
but I am somewhat, I guess, biased in my expectation that I don't expect it to impress me, only because of how much of a collecting nutcase I already am. So I don't expect them to show me anything that genuinely like wows me, but I'm open to that possibility. If they're like, oh, by the way, we have a different Nintendo PlayStation prototype, one that was made just by Nintendo, Sony didn't make it, and here it is, then I will be like, oh boy,
oh god,
you know that,
yeah,
that would get,
but...
yeah, no, of course it's not, but that's the kind of thing where I would get excited. But they're like, look, this is called the N64. I'd be like, oh great, cool.
Yeah.
Like, that's awesome. Yeah. Anyway, so I think that'll do it here, unless you have anything else to add to this.
No, we covered it pretty much.
All right. Well, then, thank you very much to Sinjeet for, I guess you didn't really select the subject, but it was yours all the same, so thank you. Shout out earlier to, of course, for Abdullah. And also, sorry, dude, that once again you were having technical problems. Hopefully we get that resolved soon enough. Spencer Puryear for the previous subject. Shout-outs again to Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, Tim Inman, Trey Wagner, Jeb Malcolm, as well as obviously Joseph. Thank you very much as always for joining me. Appreciate the support. And yeah, everybody, if you're out there, once again, please like, comment, subscribe, check all the social media stuff in the description: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, obviously Patreon. I appreciate the support, getting early access to this, shout outs, pick subjects, and of course, even be on here. So, Joseph, any final thoughts?
No, just glad to be on here.
Right on, man. All right, well, thank you everybody for watching, and we'll see you all later.